Hello, everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamers Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. We're diving right back into the player's guide here today, but first, let me just say I'm aware that I need to make a couple of corrections to some videos over in the DM guide, making better campaigns and all that. Most notably, the Cloak and Dagger series. Somehow I jumped up from part 4 to part 6 without realizing it. I'm chalking that up to, at that point in time, most of the household was still recovering from being sick. My wife fighting it off and on, and I was a bit tired myself. So that's probably how all that happened. At least that's the answer I'm going to go with. But I got to fix that, along with the one or two other errors floating around out there. But in due time. For today, I'm sure you'll notice I'm missing my headset. It's faithful, loyal, absolutely adequate item. It has served me well in this purpose, but it's certainly much more suited to a role plugging into a controller and letting me chat it up with people online playing Overwatch or Neverwinter or Monster Hunter World, or at least when I had the time for doing all of that. But I digress. Today we are diving in and taking a look at why you would ever want to play fighters in these various tabletop games. Because really, when you look at them just from a purely mechanical standpoint, fighters are pretty limited in what they're able to do. In fact, what they're good at is right there in the name. They're good at fighting. They're great at combat. They're range combat, mounted combat, foot combat, whether you're tossing axes, swords, maces, flails, spears, great swords in their hands. They will absolutely clean house when it comes to a straight up fight. But there's more to a lot of these tabletop games than that. And some tables, if you prefer running a lot of constant combat, hey, fantastic. But even then, other classes can do better at that. They have similar attack bonus progressions compared to the fighter, and they get a whole suite of other extra abilities. And this is true outside of the D20 Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder games too, to a certain extent. There's always going to be exceptions here and there depending on the game and the rule set that it follows, but generally, your fighting type characters are specialized towards combat, and in the D20 system in particular, there's not a lot outside of that they're great at. And that they can be great at is if you take Shadowrun as an example. If you're playing a street samurai and you're focused mostly on melee and a bit of shooting, you probably don't have a whole lot of karma left over to spend on developing other skills. You might get a few things here or there, like build up a decent rapport with some of your contacts, in particular your friendly local arms dealer, so that way you're equipped right for the next run that you have going. But street samurai, their role is to be the tanks. They're there to absorb damage and deal it. Certain physical adepts with their magic abilities can certainly outclass them, but then again, Street Samurai also get to have cybernetics to help boost their strength and agility and all of these other things and give them an array of other abilities. And that's where you can kind of close the gap a little bit. If you pick up some BioWare that gives you lets you release stronger and more pheromones, so that way you're more intimidating, you can be more charming and deceptive and the like for all your charisma, charm based skills and abilities. But even still, the focus is probably going to, and specialization is going to be a bit more on the combat roles, and so your character will still be less effective outside of those situations. But in Shadowrun, it's designed to be a little bit more that way. But I digress. Going back to fighters, in particular, we're looking at the D20 system, so Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder. In this, if you take a look again, at just as a purely mechanical standpoint, if you go to any forums or message boards to see how the different classes rank and stack up against one another, fighters are usually somewhere near the bottom tier. They're not the absolute worst. That's usually reserved for a lot of the NPC classes like the warrior. But even still, fighters still don't rank up very high. They're typically outclassed by other well, other classes. Paladin's a great example. Paladin, since they're focused a bit more on charisma for a lot of their abilities, their charisma tends to be a bit higher. They have a little bit more knowledge and social skills. So, and coupled with that higher charisma, they're better able to serve as like a party face. So they can be diplomatic. They can. It might be a little strange to see a paladin bluff, but it wouldn't be entirely unusual, or at least entirely outside the realm of possibility. They have the same attack bonus progression as a fighter does. Really, the only thing that they don't get is the whole host of feats that a fighter will typically get over the course of gameplay. And feats allow fighters and other characters to unlock a whole bunch of different combat abilities, different other little bonuses that they can throw in and stack on their character. But then again, you can argue that the paladin doesn't really need all that because they get a little bit of spell casting, they get a little bit of healing that they can use either on themselves or others. Eventually, their charisma will act as a bonus on top of all their saves for their fortitude, reflexes, and will. So they're quite a bit more robust in that fashion. And in particular, since paladins have a higher will save overall, they tend to do better against the things fighters are weak against, which again is their will save and to a certain extent their reflex saves as well. But that all gets into particular builds. But the point being is that a paladin is probably a bit more flexible and able to adapt to different roles in comparison to the fighter. So mechanically, a paladin is superior to the fighter. But what else? Again, weak will saves for the fighter. Weak, not the weakest, but still fairly weak reflex saves. So they're subject to fireballs, traps, so many different things that may happen either outside of or in combat. Really, a straight up fight is what they're best at. They don't even get that many skill points, so you're not going to be distributing those and have a wide array of skills and abilities. You're probably looking at a little bit of climbing, a little bit of swimming, maybe knowledge tactics, and definitely perception, or if you're playing 3rd edition, spot and listen. But you're certainly not going to be maxing out a whole bunch of skills to make a really well skilled and adept person. It's going to all be combat. So why would you play a fighter? Well, first, because although the fighter is really limited, if you're looking at a short campaign and you're starting off at really low levels, about levels 1 through 4-ish, is really where the fighter is going to shine. So the other combat classes can too, but fighters in particular tend to do really well because lower levels, the characters are all starting off at not quite similar starts. The rogue will have more skills, so will a ranger, but classes like wizards and clerics and your druids, which typically are your top number 1 tier character classes, don't really have all that much going for them. The cleric maybe not as bad as the wizard, but wizards don't have a whole array of spells or abilities, and beyond that, wizards don't quite have much going for them, especially starting out. And a fighter with a good feat selection can really absolutely clean house when it comes to combat. I mean, quick draw, power attack, and cleave, using a two-handed weapon, you can usually wipe out most of the first level monsters you might be running into in one shot. And with cleave, you're taking on and getting extra hits, so really a first level fighter or second level fighter can do a ton of damage right up front. So this is where the character will really shine. Once you get to mid and late game, as the other classes start unlocking more and more of their abilities, so they get more and more spells that they can make use of, fighter's not really quite doing so much without the support of the other characters. But early on, especially if you're just looking at short campaigns, fighter's probably one of your best picks. Fighter, barbarian, ranger can be, but yeah, fighter's absolutely fantastic for starting off. The other thing is, because they're so limited, it's an easy way to introduce new players to tabletop gaming, especially Dungeons and Dragons and the like. With fighters, there's not as many different things to keep track of, so it's an easy way for the player to pay attention and learn how to play the game starting out before building into or taking on other characters and other classes that have more abilities for them to keep track of or try to remember. So, in that way, it's a great way to introduce the game to these players. And then the other reason why you might want to play a fighter is if you're for veteran players, because you're so limited on what you can do, or at least ideally, you start thinking a bit more creatively and outside of the box about what you can do with what you do have, kind of MacGyvering up your own unique little solutions that might not come to you otherwise. Not to say that you can't get creative with the other more ability laden classes. It's just since you're playing at such a handicap, especially at higher levels, you do have to be a little bit more quicker on your feet and play a little bit more with a little bit more smarts than you might otherwise would. Again, not that you don't have to be smart with the other classes. It's just when you have such a flexible array of options in front of you, it's easier to overcome a lot of challenges. Whereas with a fighter with a limited array of abilities, it's quite a bit more difficult. So that can make gameplay quite a bit more interesting. But for me, what I think of, especially from a storyteller's perspective and running game worlds, it comes down to a certain sense of logic, consistency, and what would make the most sense and the most realistic sense. And it's funny associating realistic with fantasy, but there still has to be a consistent internal logic to the world in order for it to make sense. And when you take a look at the various classes that are available, it makes more sense that there would be more fighters in the world than probably most of the other classes. Fighters or rogues or barbarians and the like were probably going to be your most common character classes. The reason for that being, when it comes to fighters, think about the early medieval, late medieval periods. Reading and writing was not an incredibly common thing. It got more common as time went on, but the ability of the common people to read and write didn't exactly come about a whole lot. It was a lot of physical manual labor. Not that these people weren't intelligent, it's just their intelligence and their abilities were applied to different skills that were needed for the day and age. And so when you think about that, not that there isn't a science or a level of cleverness and ingenuity that comes with fighting, there absolutely is. There's a reason why Muhammad Ali called boxing the sweet science. But it is easier to develop those skills, especially given the setting, when there's not a whole lot of book learning involved, where there's not a whole lot of time for it gets called higher thought, for let's call it academic thought. So it makes more sense that there are more physically inclined people that are alive and exist in this type of a setting. And because it's a common and easy-ish relatively easy to develop skill set, it makes sense that there are more of these people out there. Whereas if you take a look at, say, a wizard, wizards require years of study and an apprenticeship to some sort of master, or at least a more learned wizard. They need to have a higher degree of intelligence to be more effective. You can be a moderately intelligent wizard, but to cast a higher level spells, you have to have a greater degree of intelligence, implying you have to have a greater degree of knowledge and understanding. That's a little bit rare, especially again given the setting when everything's a little bit more focused on the physically oriented. Not only that, but wizards have to know how to read, and not only do they have to know how to read, they have to know how to read and write in really esoteric languages and scripts like draconic, not druidic, demonic, abyssal, infernal, celestial, all of these different strange and esoteric and really, really rare languages that very few people, especially very few mortal people, would know how to speak, or let alone read and write. So that, again, that coupled with that higher degree of intelligence, the requirement for training and knowing these languages, that amounts to a fairly rare person. And again, depending on setting or how you're running the story, the wizard may have to have an inherent ability to tap into and access the arcane energies flowing around. I don't quite run it that way, but I've played in some games where that was had to be part of your character. They had to have some inherent ability to already touch on and access magic. Sort of like what you see in Harry Potter. You have muggles, non-magic folk, and then you have wizards and witches that are magically inclined. They're able to access and utilize magic. So that kind of a concept. Those things would make magic relatively rare. Some settings may make it a little bit more common, a bit easier to learn, especially if there's a greater abundance of reading and writing material available to educate people and really exercise the mind more. But again, fighters would logically be more common and more regularly found throughout the world. So just from context, setting, and story and lore, it makes sense for there to be fighters, and it's easy to roll up and play as a fighter because there are going to be plenty of them. And that's just one small example right there. And again, depending on the game or setting, fighters may be more inclined to be played, like like if you're playing in a more kung fu oriented campaign. Certainly you would see more martially adept and inclined people over people that utilize magic and the like. Not always, but it'd be more likely. So, those are some reasons to play fighters right there over why you wouldn't. And for me, the fighter class is actually near and dear to me. I love playing as fighters. Doesn't matter the system, doesn't matter the game. Sword and board, going two-handed with a weapon, it all is just so much fun for me. And it's probably just because I've been doing it so much, but I just really have a knack for that particular play style. I mean, I main Reinhardt on Overwatch for a reason. It's because it's what I'm familiar with and what I'm comfortable with, and I understand it, and I do work with it really well. And it's no exception here either in the D20 setting. I love fighters. I don't care that they're lower tier. They're just awesome. I mean, how badass is it having this image in your head? Dragons bearing down on you, towns burning all around you. You're the last line of defense. The wizard's trying to cast or get a spell ready to cast, but you need to buy them time. So you get the dragon's attention, sword and shield out. You're facing it down, and you are ready to go. Staunch, bloodied, beaten and broken, but entirely unbowed as you stare down this draconic menace that's just bearing down on you. I mean, it's a classic image, but it is classic for a reason. It's just so utterly badass. And when you think about it, this is a person that's hanging out with people who use magic and is like, yeah, I can keep up with this. Not always able to, but you know what? If the wizard's doing their job right, they're doing their best to support you and enhance your ability to kill things and making you just go and absolutely wreck shop even faster using spells like haste or enlarge person and the like, just to make you an absolute murder machine on the battlefield. Oh, I did forget one other weakness when it comes to fighters. Fighters are really, really limited by the equipment that they have, because if you're wanting to fight demons, you need to have a holy weapon. If you want to fight werewolves, you need to have a silvered weapon. And in some cases, for both, you need to have a good and silver weapon in order to really effectively hurt the targets. And unless you have a plethora of magic items handy that will allow you to do that, you're going to need a cleric. You're going to need a wizard on hand to help throw down some temporary enchantments to boost your weapon's effectiveness, depending on the target at hand. But that's all circumstantial and comes out over roleplay, and really, I love role-playing as fighters. And one thing that you can do, especially if you talk with your DM a little bit, even though technically your fighter doesn't have a whole lot of social skills, it's not like they're completely socially inept. You don't have to purposely cripple them unless you're going for that, in which case do it and have fun with it. Just really lean into it. But, you know, fighters can absolutely have some role-playing interaction, and for players that are role-playing really well, leaning into their character and adopting things, adopting the personality really well, and just making gameplay fun, I tend to relax a little bit on some of these social skill roles. Not all of them, because if they're dealing with heads of state or trying to intimidate, say, like some sort of crime boss, then yeah, they need to make a roll. But if they're trying to gather information, or if they're trying to make friends and pal around with people in for whatever reason or motivation they may have, if they're just leaning into the character and they're role playing it out, that's where I tend to relax the roles a little bit, just to make it more fun and to keep the player engaged, because number one is player engagement, and if you're constantly excluding them from situations where you're making it feel like they can't contribute, that's where you get bored players. I know I excuse me, I know I certainly get bored when I feel like I can't share in the spotlight. I don't need to hog it, but you got to let all your players have some time and get them into the game. And, you know, relaxing on some of these roles and these requirements for various skill checks can be appropriate sometimes and make the fighter class much more inviting for your players overall. And when it comes right down to it, another great reason to play fighters is there's such a degree of customization, because they get so many feats. You can adapt it to fit so many different styles and create different cultural differences. I mean, there's something just absolutely classic about a fighter with a greatsword, but historically the greatsword was not a really common weapon. It was something that you would typically see more on honor guards and the like. A fairly unique situation, but more often than not you'd see different pole arms, like, you know, spears, glaives, halberds, pole hammers, sword and shield, sword and axe, sword and mace, or I'm sorry, shield and mace, shield and axe, things like this. You know, there'd be a wide variety. And then, you know, I've said before, there's so many different styles of swords out there. You can really mix things up and make the fighter feel a bit more unique and different every time. You can do the same with a lot of the other classes, but with the fighter, with that wide array of feat selection and that automatic starting proficiency with all armors, all shields except tower shields, and all weapons except for exotic weapons, fighters can really be made and customized to really shine and be really truly unique and ultimately badass characters. But that's just those are just my thoughts on opinions on why to play fighters, taking a look at some of the pros and cons there. I'd certainly love to know yours, so please comment down below with your own thoughts and ideas on fighters. Anything that I may have missed here, absolutely let me know. Only way I'm going to get better is if I get feedback, whether it's positive or negative or constructive. I need all of it. But with that said, I'm going to let you go for now. If you've been enjoying all my content here, consider giving me a like here down at the video below, especially if you like today's video. If you've been, like I said, if you've been enjoying everything, maybe consider subscribing to the channel here. And if you do subscribe, click the bell icon over there so that way you get notified the next time I upload content here. YouTube's not always the greatest about it, but with that said, I have been Jordan, your host, your storyteller extraordinaire, and master of lore. Thank you all for your time. You guys have yourselves a good night.